Good evening, sir. Sir Mark Tully, it is a pleasure having you here. I am Vikant Sahai. I report for Herald newspaper. I also reported for BBC in the past. My question to you is on your book, Non-Stop India. Do you think the Non-Stop India has become more intolerant now?
The north of India.
The non-stop India, has it become more intolerant?
Yeah, I think a new element of tension, if not intolerance, has been introduced into India, certainly. And of course, that is the tension which has been introduced in Hindu-Muslim relations. I think there's no doubt about that.
Hello, sir. I'm Aman Agarwal. My question is on the point that you made on rural development. And do you think for rural development an overhaul of the bureaucracy is more required than everything that's happening right now? And if so, is there any political party, regional or national, today in the country that's actually looking at an overhaul of the bureaucracy to ensure services are being delivered to our citizens?
Well, yeah, I think it's not more which is required, it's more effective. It's something, the deliverance has to be greater. It's not a question, as I said earlier, just of money. It's very much a question of making more efficient and effective. And that, I think, certainly should be done. And I think it needs administrative reforms. There have been so many administrative reforms commissions under the Janta government. There was an excellent police commission report produced, but these reports don't get implemented. That's the trouble. We can't go on, you know, I think it was in Jajja again, I was told that the collector in Jajja sits on 70 different committees and is chairman of most of those committees. Well, how can anyone do an effective job if they're sitting on 70 different committees? And the office of the collector is still really the old-fashioned British officer and the old-fashioned British way of doing administration. And what is not realized enough is the ambition of the British rule was basically law and order. That was the fundamental ambition. The ambition of the Indian government is development and providing the freedom and the law and order and everything as citizens of a democracy are entitled to expect. And those are two very, very different things. In the case of police, one friend of mine who sadly died recently, who was chief of police in Punjab among many other senior officers, he wrote a book in which he talked about the difference between a governing police force and a serving police force. And of course, the serving police force, it would be a reformed police force fit for a democracy. But in fact, we have a governing police force.
We'll take one more question before coming back to the stage. Over here, please.
My name is Divya Singhal. I am a faculty at Goa Institute of Management. Sir, you talked about lynching. Today, voices are being suppressed. Right to information is being tweaked. A lot of things are happening. Policing is on rise. Government policing is on rise. So in this scenario, like a new journalist, a budding journalist, what is the incentive? How, or writers, I mean to say, how do you see this scenario? Your comments.
Well, that's a difficult one, isn't it? Well, I think the journalist's responsibility is always to try and get the story out, tell the story truthfully, tell stories which he thinks is important, and generally behave in a way as a watchdog on the government. But of course, journalists are very often limited by the organizations they work for. And one very unfortunate development in the electronic media is the commercial ownership of a lot of television stations, and then the owners put their business and their relations with the government ahead of journalism. But I always think that it's important to mention the exceptions as well. And if, for instance, you are depressed about television in this country, being not reporting the sort of things that you speak of, I do think that NDTV does do a lot of stories like that. And I think, for instance, Ravish on NDTV Hindi is an outstanding journalist. As far as the written press was concerned, again, I think some papers are very much on the side of government, and some are more balanced. You have to realize that actually, even in a country like Britain, which is in a way, a stable democracy, we have newspapers which are wholly pro the government and newspapers which are wholly anti the government. If any of you had been reading The Guardian before Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, and you read The Guardian's series of stories on Boris Johnson, you would think the Conservative Party must be completely balmy to ever elect such a man. Some people still think that. So there is a place for a journalism which is pro-government and a journalism which is anti-government. There's no doubt about that. But when people talk about the situation in the country being like the emergency, well, that's nonsense, I can tell you. Because during the emergency, there was outright censorship. You were told what you could write, you were told what you could not write. And all the foreign press, including myself, were ordered out of the country. The press, the Indian press, as I said, was severely censored. Quite often papers would publish blank front pages because they said they were not allowed to publish any of the news, but then they'd get punished for doing that. So we certainly haven't reached that stage. But I do think, yes, perhaps we need more lively criticism of what's going on.
So Mark, do you really think that there's a huge difference between what was happening during the emergency and now? Because during the emergency, at least you had papers like the Statesman and the Indian Express, which had the guts to produce a blank page. Wouldn't it have been a great source of inspiration to many journalists if we had seen at least one newspaper in this country produce a blank page after what happened in Kashmir and after different leaders were
But
here?
Rajasthan Patrakar did that a year ago or 2 years ago. It was either a blank editorial page or a blank first page, but it was much before that. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. To some extent, I would agree that it would be good if some papers had protested more vigorously about what's happening in Kashmir. But there has been a lot of criticism of it in articles. It's not adequate, I would agree. But really, it's not the same as the emergency, in my view. And Kashmir is one incident, whereas, of course, the emergency was the censorship was a daily occurrence.
Yeah, but emergency was a nationwide thing. So
Yes.
obviously in terms of issues.
Yes.
Mark, getting back to the role of religion in public life. I mean, we can make laws about the proper place of religion, but it is ultimately determined by the interplay between, what is written in the laws, whatever the laws are, and politics and practice. So it is something. It's something which is moving all the time. The contours of, or the exact place of religion in public life. Given that the European version of secularism, not even the more extreme one as in France, but say the British one or in continental Europe, given the understanding of secularism, the practice of secularism in Europe, and the way secularism is understood and practiced in India, given the tensions inherent in both kinds of secularism, where do you think the proper place of religion is, especially in a multi-religious, multi-ethnic country like India, but also others, where because of immigration and other reasons, because of immigrants from Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, the profile, the demographic profile of these countries has changed so much in the last 4 or 5 decades?
Well, yes, I have views about this which are, some people would say, controversial. But my view is, first of all, that secularism is not the right word to use in the Indian context at all, because secularism has a connotation of hostility to all religions or indifference about religion. And Indians are not hostile to religion, and Indians are not indifferent to religion. There's a huge difference between the atmosphere in a country like France or Britain towards religion, and in the personal devotion to their religion in India and in the West. And I've always thought that really what the mistake the Congress Party made was to continue with this word secularism. Because I think, and this is, I hope I can get it clear, but if you have any questions, do ask. I think that secularism, as I said, carries this anti-religious connotation. And that left the BJP free to say, we are the party of Hindus. And this is the Hinduism which is India's Hinduism. Whereas I think the Congress should have found in its politics some place for the Hindu community, just as much as it found for Muslims and others. And I think that the place, what the Congress should say is, yes, is a country where 80% of the population call themselves Hindus, and we believe that the Hinduism which is natural to India is a pluralistic religion, a religion which is proud of being tolerant and welcoming to other religions, proud of India's history, long history of religion, believes in discussion and openness. In other words, said, this is India's Hinduism, not Hindutva. And in doing this, Congress, I believe, could say, if you are an Indian, you can really be proud of your country because of its unique tolerance, its unique pluralism, and the unique role that Hinduism has played in providing or in sustaining that pluralism and all that goes with it. And that's what I think the place of religion and the place of Hinduism in this country should be. And I do think that for years and years, Congress were playing up this secularism business, Meanwhile, they were completely ignoring the fact that 80% of the country are Hindus. Now, I don't know if I've got that.
So, Mark
clear.
Tully,
I'll get back to that a little later.
So, Mark, with your permission, may I quote a passage from your book,
Yes,
which
please.
basically answers his question in your words. And I knew this would come up, so I marked this passage out to share with everybody. This is in No Full Stops in India, in your preface, you write, what in fact the majority of people in the West have done is to consign religion to the rubbish bin. Modern Indians inevitably follow our example, and anyone who does not believe in keeping religion out of all forms of public life is regarded as communal. The elite's so-called secularism inevitably degenerates into disrespect for religion. What I think is manifestly wrong is to disturb the religious beliefs of those who have no hope of any other comfort, which is exactly what we have taught and are still teaching the Indian elite to do. Not surprisingly, this is producing a backlash in India, Hindu fundamentalism. So again, while there can be a debate on this, and as you said that you've been controversial, this is exactly that same controversial passage which can lead to a lot of other questions, but we leave it to the audience.
I wrote that some time ago. So
I understand that.
I haven't changed my mind now.
A couple of more questions. Questions from the audience. Two more. Just wait for the mic to come.
Sethi, and I would like to ask you for a personal assessment of the Prime Minister.
Do I give him A or Z from Mark? So I think one thing I would say about the Prime Minister, he is an extraordinarily successful publicist. And I would say that what has happened in this country is really quite extraordinary. You know, Amit Shah went around the country saying he wanted to have a Congress Mukt India, get rid of the Congress party. Well, what he's actually also achieved in doing is getting a BJP Mukt India as well, because all politics has become about the Prime Minister, about Modi. If you watch the television, even today, you see the preparations for what's going to happen in Houston. The whole thing is an enormous personality cult. That's what's taken over politics in this country. And as far as rating him, well, I don't really want to exactly rate him, but what I would say is that like everything else, like Indira Gandhi, there are good things about him and there are bad things about him. I do very much believe that when there are atrocities committed, he should speak out. He should make it absolutely clear where he stands on that sort of thing. I do think also, as I've said, that he should do much more about administrative reform. And it's all very well to go on announcing Pradhan Mantri Yojana Ye, Pradhan Mantri Yojana Wo, but then you've got to make sure that they are implemented. And I've written an article actually in the on the Wire, where I said that one of the things Modi manages to do is he does manage to get people to forget things which have not gone too well by having some new tamasha, as I put it. You know, for instance, the election was the classic example of this. There was no discussion of how well or how badly his programs had been implemented. The whole thing was turned into a jamboree about Indian nationalism and Hinduism. And Modi allowed himself to be promoted basically as a sadhu almost. Now, in doing all this, he was distorting the whole political debate. During an election, the public is entitled to witness and take part in a political debate. But they couldn't do this time because of this whole personality cult business and because of the way Modi goes from what I called in this article, I think, surprise and sensation, from one to the other, so that people really forget the former ones in the excitement of the present one.
Yeah, my name is Sudhir Rao. I would be happy if you could go down the memory lane and tell us about the most challenging assignment you had in India.
Most talented.
Challenging, yes.
Well, I'll tell you my favorite Prime Minister actually was very underestimated. Hmm?
What was the most challenging assignment?
Oh, I thought you said Prime Minister. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, that's a very difficult one. But Ayodhya was actually a pretty challenging one because we were covering the day of the pulling down of the temple, and as you know, rioting broke out as soon as the temple started to come down, and the press were particularly the targets of the rioters, and I had to get out of Ayodhya and go to Faizabad to file a story because all the telephone lines in Ayodhya had been pulled down, and at BBC you have to file a story in voice. So I had to get back to Faizabad, but that was difficult enough because rioting had spread and tires were burning in roads and that sort of thing. We got back to Faizabad, I filed the story, and then with 3 other Indian journalists, we tried to get back to Ayodhya again. Well, eventually, by going down cart tracks virtually and side roads, we managed to get there. And when we reached Ayodhya itself, and Faizabad and Ayodhya are about 5 miles apart, when we reached there, as we got out of the car, we were surrounded by these car sevaks, so-called. And as soon as they saw me, they said, "Ye BBC wala hai." And some of them were saying Maro Sarpi, and calling him quite polite names. And others were saying, "Ne, what to mashura behai, he's a well-known man and it will look very bad if we beat him up." So the compromise was reached, and I was locked up in a room in the Dharamsala of this particular temple. And after I'd been locked up, I could hear the Indian journalists talking to the car sevaks. And the car sevaks said, "You're Indians, we have nothing against you. It's only these foreigners, so you go away." And they said, "No, we will not go away until you let him out." So in the end, they said, "Okay, you can be shut up as well." So we were shut up all together, and eventually we were rescued by the Mahant of another different temple. But that was one of the harder stories I covered.
Talking about challenges, and you talked about how the Indian state at the grassroots, and especially the rural areas, is something which is completely different from how people in this room experience the state, although we also have our own share of bad experiences with the state. Related to the question which is about challenges, did you ever find yourself in a situation where you could not report because the local authorities, the police or the administration said no, journalists cannot, and you being a foreign journalist were especially left out. They made sure that you could not report from that particular place.
Not really that I remember. Of course, I mean, the emergency is the exception. No, not really, but I remember times when, for instance, in Pakistan, once when we were covering a riot, and the district administration came along and said, you people are causing riots. We said we weren't, and the police tried to shoo us away, but we stood our ground, and we weren't shooed by them.
You have written about, recently you made a remark in one of your newspaper columns that fake news is nothing new. You mentioned a couple of examples from the 1970s when there were stories which made headlines but were actually not true. But what is it really that you see as the main difference in that work environment, or the tools that journalists have or do not have as compared to, say, between 70s, 80s and today? I mean, of course, technology has made a big difference, and fake stories or rumor, etc., which finds its way into the newspapers. In terms of scale, in terms of everything, I mean, scope, it has magnified enormously.
Oh yes, yeah. I mean, obviously, when I left the BBC, if I remember right, you didn't even have emails. I remember in the slightly eccentric office we ran, we had it's sufficiently eccentric to have a ping pong table in the middle of it. And when the Director General BBC came to inspect the office, he said, "Oh, this is the first senior BBC office I've ever seen with a ping pong table." And I said to him, before I could, how words slip out of your mouth, which you wished you hadn't uttered, I found myself saying to him, "Well, you're the first person who's called it a senior BBC editorial office." But also another eccentric feature of this office in the last days of my time was that we had a computer, but we didn't have the first idea what to do with it. Didn't seem to be connected to anything. So it became very useful to play patience on. So, yeah, things have changed hugely. And I think some of the practices which have come in are very unfortunate. I think it's so easy now to connect with people that you get so much more of the reporter standing there speaking off the top of his head, and you don't get the same classic, well-written, well-thought-out dispatches which you used to
From
get.
the field, you mean? I mean, people are going less and less to the field, and they just make phone calls to their contacts in the field and report on that basis.
Well, that is also a problem, but I think in particular the problem of reporters, and it's particularly bad in some of the Indian television channels, where the reporter clearly hasn't thought out what he's going to talk about. And he goes on blathering, and you see the wretched anchor, as they call him, saying, yes, Amit, yes, Amit, but then it goes on and on and on. And if you actually listen carefully, you'll find he's told the same story 3 times.
Do you watch TV?
Yes.
Okay. Sujay, one more question, and then we'll go back.
Yeah, this is about journalism in English. And you've spoken many times that you had a problem getting Indians with an accent on air in the BBC because they had to be perfect. But if a Frenchman decided to report for the BBC, the people at Bush House used to be very excited with French accents and the fact that they were speaking English. But when it came to India, they were not very comfortable. And in the same vein, you also said that the penchant for English that we Indians have, especially the elite, that has led to Indian languages getting Bangalored, taking off from the term of how Bangalore took away IT jobs from the US. You actually said that journalism in English has actually Bangalored other Indian languages. But the point that I'm trying to make is that without the use of English, would the entire country be covered? Because France speaks one language, India speaks so many, over 25 languages. So the thing is, one understands what you're saying, but the practicality of having English as a unifying language also cannot be underscored enough.
Yeah, well, that's very, very current, of course, after Mr. Amit Shah's remarks. Yeah, I do believe, I once gave a lecture to people from the English-Speaking Union, which is an organization dedicated to the spreading of English. And I had the audacity to say that I did think English did damage to Indian languages. I was amazed. Afterwards we had coffee or something like that, and I was amazed when a guy came up to me from the English-Speaking Union and said, "You are absolutely right. English is a killer language." I was amazed. I thought he'd be very cross with me. And there is a dilemma, and it's just a question, I think, of trying to keep things in balance, of recognizing that English is a killer language, but recognizing in the Indian context it has a certain role, but making absolutely certain, and I think particularly in education, absolutely certain that everyone knows and is proud of their mother tongue. And I think it is perfectly possible for this to be done in education as well. I think one of the tragedies of India is that there are a whole lot of little schools claiming to be English medium, where the teachers themselves don't know English properly, where the children emerge knowing neither English nor their mother tongue properly, and where at the same time, quite often, and I found this particularly and wrote about it in Tamil Nadu, there are excellent government schools. But because of the influence of English, the lure of English, when I went to one of these government schools and I asked the children what their parents did, all of them came from the poorest 4 sections of society. Now, I don't in the least deny the huge importance of the poorest of 4 sections going to good schools. But this school should all have had a decent mix of society. But all the kids whose parents could possibly afford it were being sent to these English schools. And that is the sort of imbalance, I think, which English creates in this country. I believe that as far as Hindi is concerned, my strong belief is that Hindi is spreading anyhow. There's no doubt about that. Even in the South, you find that lots of people are actually learning Hindi because the job opportunities that there are in North India. But if you try and impose Hindi, well then you just stir up a hornet's nest. So that's my personal belief. But I do believe, I really feel very strongly about this, that English should live with Indian languages, not be a superior or language elite or anything like that.